Daniel 5, verses 1 to 12. Would you join with me as I read it? King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem, he brought that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought in the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Immediately, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, opposite the lampstand. And the king saw that the hand as it wrote. Then the king's color changed, and his thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. The king called loudly to bring in the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers. The king declared to the wise men of Babylon, "Whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom." Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king the interpretation. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed, and his color changed, and his lords were perplexed. The queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banqueting hall, and the queen declared, "O king, live forever. Let not your thoughts alarm you, or your color change. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. In the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and astrologers, because an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation."
Thanks, Harry. Good morning, everyone. Hope you guys had a happy new year. And it's good to be back here as we continue our series in the book of Daniel. And so it's been a little bit since we've been in the book of Daniel, so I just want to give you just a quick refresher of what we've been talking about in the past 4 chapters. It's kind of actually a nice little break, because the 4 chapters that we've had was all about King Nebuchadnezzar. Now, the question is, King Nebuchadnezzar was the king of Babylon, and how did the Israelites get there? Well, if you kind of know your Old Testament history a little bit, because of the sin and because of the idolatry of the Israelites, God eventually sent them into exile. So King Nebuchadnezzar conquered the southern kingdom of Judah, and around 600 years before Christ, Daniel was part of this group that was brought into Babylon, and they were expected to integrate into Babylonian culture. And so this is kind of where the theme of our series comes in, because the tagline for our series is a hope that leads to faithfulness. Right? And the idea is that Daniel had some pretty difficult waters in order to trek through while he was in Babylon. And it was a lot of pressure for him to be integrated and be assimilated into the Babylonian culture. But yet, as he hung on to the hope that he had in God, what happened is, as we see in the book of Daniel, is that he lives a life of faithfulness to God because of the hope that he has in God. And the idea of our series is that, and as he was doing that, he had to do a lot of different things, right? So for example, sometimes he was doing the things that everybody else would do. So for example, he accepted his new name, was Belteshazzar. He spoke a new language. He was being educated in the Babylonian schools, right? He looked like the rest of society, right? Doing everything that everyone else was doing. But other times, as we'll see, he stood out. For example, not eating the food or not bowing down to the statue, right? And the idea is that it's actually really complicated, right? There's no black and white rules in terms of how to live as a Christian in our society, right? And so sometimes we see him doing the things that everyone else is doing, and sometimes he's doing some things that is completely different from culture. And the idea of our series is that, as we navigate this complicated world, may we also have this hope. May we also settle with this hope that we have in God that will lead us to live faithful lives in the culture that we are in. And so the first 4 chapters center around Daniel and his interactions with Nebuchadnezzar, or maybe it's a little bit more accurate to say that the first four chapters was God's interactions with Nebuchadnezzar through Daniel, because as we ended in chapter 4, what we saw was really a letter from Nebuchadnezzar to the world, right, explaining basically his testimony, right, how he came to have faith in Christ. Or not in Christ, but in God, because Christ came 600 years later. But chapter 4 is basically how he came to worship the one true God. Well, here in chapter 4, there's a sudden shift to Belshazzar. Actually, even though as we were reading through the text, it says, your father Nebuchadnezzar. Belshazzar actually wasn't Nebuchadnezzar's direct son or direct descendant. In the Bible, sometimes when you see the word father being used, it can be used to be, say, a male descendant way in your past, or it can just mean a previous king of the same kingdom, right? So for example, the New Testament, right, people will say, Jews would say, my father Abraham. Was father their actual father? No, of course not, right? He's 4,000 years ago. But yeah, it's called Father Abraham, just meaning a descendant in their past. And so there's actually a lot of drama that happened between chapters 4 and chapters 5. And so I just want to, just in terms of introduction, kind of tell you about some of this drama that happened in this huge shift between chapters 4 and 5. And so after Nebuchadnezzar came this guy named Amel-Marduk. And Amel-Marduk reigned for less than a year before he was assassinated. And so after him came a guy named Neriglissar, who reigned for about 4 years. And it seemed like he was kind of old and died a natural death. We don't know exactly what happened to him. After that was a guy named Labashi-Marduk, who actually ascended the throne as a child. And this is really terrible because this child's king was murdered after 9 months by this guy named Nabonidus, who took over the throne. Like I said, a lot of drama that happened between chapters 4 and 5 that the Bible doesn't talk about. But we know this from the history and the annals that have come down to us through history. We know kind of what happened. So Nabonidus took the throne. Now, you might be thinking, okay, if Nabonidus is the king, right, then who is Belshazzar that we have in the beginning of this chapter? Well, for reasons unknown to us, Nabonidus didn't like to spend much time in Babylon. My personal guess, we don't know for sure, but maybe he didn't want to get assassinated, or maybe there's some other reason why he didn't want to spend time in Babylon, but he chose to spend most of his time away from the city of Babylon. And so what happened was, like, he took his son, Belshazzar, so his son was Belshazzar, and Belshazzar basically sat on the throne and reigned while his dad was off, somewhere vacationing somewhere else. And so that's why here in the beginning of chapter 4 it says that Belshazzar was basically this co-regent, right? He was reigning in the place of his dad while his dad was away. And I should probably point out that this particular detail of Belshazzar actually was a source of critique for the Bible for a really, really long time, because in history books, all we hear about is Nabonidus, right? Nabonidus was the king over Babylon. And so when you read Daniel chapter 5, it says King Belshazzar, and the historians were like, who is Belshazzar? There is no King Belshazzar, right? The Bible must not know what it's talking about because this king did not exist in history. Well, that was until about 1854-ish, when archaeologists discovered what's called the cylinders of Nabonidus. And so I actually have a picture for you of the cylinders of Nabonidus. I cannot read that. It's don't know what language. I think it's written in the old Babylonian language. And so these are called the cylinders of Nabonidus, which basically explains within these cylinders that Belshazzar was his son, and that his son ruled basically he said Belshazzar was my son. And so this is the first time in history that we're able to prove that there was a guy named Belshazzar, and he was indeed Nabonidus' son. And actually, if you look at our passage this morning as well, it actually also affirms this, right? Because it says in 7, it says, "Whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck, and shall be third ruler in the kingdom." And the question is, why couldn't Belshazzar make Daniel the second ruler in the kingdom? Well, of course, it's because his dad was the first, right? He was the second, and so the highest position that he can offer to the next person would be the third ruler. Now, it might be interesting to note that this is actually not the only instance where there has been critique to the Bible that has later been explained through archaeological finds. So for example, even the pool of Bethesda in John chapter, was it John chapter 5, is it? Or 11? I don't remember exactly. But the pool of Bethesda was also described as having those 5 colonnades, and then for a long time people are like, there's no such pool that exists in Jerusalem until a little bit in the 19th century when archaeology also discovered the pool of Bethesda, and you can actually go and visit that now in Jerusalem. And so, even though we don't necessarily need archaeology to confirm the accuracy of the Bible, right? It's always nice when archaeology can confirm that the Bible does indeed know what it's talking about, right? And Daniel did indeed write this at that time. People would have known exactly what was going on at that time and describing exactly what was happening. So, and so with that, as we come to our passage this morning, what we find is Belshazzar throwing a party, right? And at first, it doesn't really seem like there's much going on here, right? It's probably not uncommon for a king of his stature to be throwing a party for thousands of people, right? But what's hidden behind this historical context, and actually we find out about this later on in chapter 5, is there's actually a whole historical context that goes around this party that is happening in Babylon. You see, while this party was going on, there was actually an enormous Persian army that was gathering outside the walls of Babylon, led by Cyrus the Great. And he was taking his army. He's already defeated the Babylonians in battles previous to this instance, and so the Babylonians were all huddled into their city as kind of their last line of defense, and the Persian Empire was surrounding the city, preparing for a siege. And at that point, and so as they were all gathering around this city, and as the Persian army is closing in on the city, is when Belshazzar decides to have a party. You might think, why? Why is Belshazzar having this party when there's an invading army literally on his doorstep? And as we'll see in this passage, there's actually 3 reasons why Belshazzar felt safe. All right, 3 reasons why Belshazzar felt safe. And we're going to see that all 3 are going to fail him. All 3 reasons why Belshazzar felt safe, and the reason why he can have this party. All of these 3 reasons were going to fail him. And then at the end, we'll kind of compare this to how Daniel is responding in the midst of all these troubling times. Okay, so 3 reasons why Belshazzar felt really safe and was able to throw a party. So first is his wall. So the 3 are his walls, his gods, and his wise men. Now, the Bible doesn't actually talk about the fortifications of the city of Babylon, but we actually know from history that the walls were quite impressive. So actually back in 2018, the Babylon is in modern-day Iraq, and they actually remade the city walls. And so I like pictures. I decided to put some pictures up. And so that is a picture of the remade walls. Obviously, those aren't original. Those are a picture of those remade walls. And the thing about these walls is that they were not only high and wide, but they were also triple layered with a system of moats in between each of the walls. And so you can see in that one picture what one of the layers might look like, right? So there's walls, there are moats, there are more walls, there are more moats, and in addition to that, there are all these guard towers that were surrounding the entire city, and then there's also bronze gates rather than wood gates, right, which can burn in the case of a siege, right? So they have bronze gates defending the city. Now, not only that, the thing about Babylon is that also the river Euphrates ran through the city of Babylon. And so here's a mock of what it might have looked like. And as you can see, the river Euphrates is on the bottom, running through the city, and then the top is kind of a mock-up of a temple to the king Marduk, which is kind of the main Babylonian god at that time. Now, the river is really important because during a siege, if you're going to attack city walls, you're probably going to lose a lot of lives. And so what they did instead is they just surrounded the city, made sure no food, no water got in, and then eventually the people in the city would starve, would be hungry, and run out of food, and then they would eventually have to give up, right? And that was a much cheaper way or a much less violent way of sieging a city, right? As long as you can surround it and make sure no food gets in, eventually, the people have to give up. And unfortunately, there's been just like, really crazy cases, even when Jerusalem fell in 70 AD, right? That's exactly what the Romans did. They surrounded the city and basically just waited everybody out. And it's actually really, I always say this, but if you go and Google what happened during that siege in Jerusalem, is actually really, really gross, of even cannibalism that kind of happened within the city because of just their desperateness. So sieges back in the day, they're just really terrible. Well, war at any point in history is terrible, right? And so, so basically that's what would happen. They would surround the city and then just wait for it to come out, especially with all these walls, and you really don't want to be attacking it, as you're going to lose a lot of human lives. So the Euphrates River was actually really important because you guarantee water and you guarantee food, right? And so you couldn't just wait out the city if you are trying to siege it. And so as a result, Belshazzar had a lot of confidence in his walls. He had a lot of confidence in his city, right? He was pretty sure that no one has conquered Babylon in thousands of years. And so he says, he's like, this is going to hold, right? This is going to hold the Persian army. Now, as we're going to see next week, this was going to fail him. And I won't spoil it, although I guess you could just look it up, because it's on Wikipedia or in history. But if you want to be surprised, don't look it up. But Cyrus the Great, the commander of the Persian army, came up with an ingenious way of getting around the fortifications without losing a single soldier. And I'll tell you about how he did it next week when we get there. So what we see here, right, is that, are you guys like all looking it up now? So what we see here is that Belshazzar, he had this confidence in his walls, and it ended up being a false confidence, right? It looked really, really good on the outside, right? He felt really, really secure, really, really safe on the outside, but it actually wasn't very secure, right? And if you think about the kind of the attitude that Belshazzar had, right, as he was thinking about his life, right, he was thinking that my life is safe, my life is secure. Why? Because there's certain things in my life that make it so. And as I was thinking about that, I think it's also worth asking ourselves, right, kind of in the same way, what is it that we put our confidence in? Right, not that we have walls and not that they're invading armies necessarily, Lord willing, that will happen, in our lifetime, but you never know. But that's probably not, the confidence that we have. But yet, there are also things that we in our lives put our confidence in, right, that look really good on the outside, right, but may not be as secure as we might think that they are. All right, so for example, maybe you have confidence in, your clean bill of health, right, until that test from the doctor comes back. Or maybe you have a lot of confidence in your good habits, right, that you have wisdom in living your life. But that's until something happens to you that's completely out of your control. Or maybe you have confidence in your 401k, maybe until a recession cuts it in half. Or maybe you have a lot of confidence in the fact that you're generally a good person, right, until some life situation comes around and reveals your weaknesses. Right, in other words, I think it's interesting for us to think about, important for us to think about, just like the walls did for Belshazzar, what are the things in your life that make you feel like that make you feel safe, that make you feel like you are secure? Right, and perhaps this might be a hard question to answer, but are we trusting God in those things? Right? Are we trusting God in the things that is making us feel safe, is making us feel secure? Right, in some ways, it makes me think of Psalm 127. Right, this is part of the Psalms of Ascent, and it says, "Unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain." Right, unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. And what's interesting about this is notice that it says the builders, they still need to build. Right, the watchers still need to watch. Right, so I'm not telling you to not have a 401k and just trust God. Right, I don't think that's necessarily what the Bible teaches. But rather the question is, where is your true confidence? Right, where is your true confidence? As the builders build, as the watchers watch, their true confidence is that the Lord is behind them. The confidence that they have is in God. Right, and the question is, where does our true confidence lie? You know that beyond your careful planning, beyond your wise decisions, right? That there is a God that reigns over your whole life, right? And I think in some ways it's usually only times of weakness that really draw this out of us. But can you sing along with the psalmist in Psalm 91 who says, "He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will abide in the shadow of the Almighty. And I will say to the Lord, my refuge and my fortress, my God, in whom I trust." Right? Can we sing along with the psalmist that says, God is my refuge? Even, as people quote Psalm 23, right? It says, even though you lead me through the valley of the shadow of death, not when I happen to be in the shadow of death, but actually says it's when God leads them through the valley of the shadow of death, right? That God is still sovereign in those times where there is weakness and when there is trials in our life. Right, so I think the question that we have for us today is where in our lives does our confidence lie? Where are we? Why do we feel safe and secure in our lives? Right, and I think we can make a decision today that we can say, Lord, I'm going to trust you. No matter what my future holds, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know whether what I have is going to be taken away. But we can make a decision today, right, that says, God, I'm going to trust you no matter what happens. So I think this is the first thing that we learn here, right? As we think about Belshazzar, we think about the confidence that he has, right? And the confidence that he has in his walls. I think for us, right, what are the things in our lives that is causing us to feel safe and confident, right? And what does it look like for us to say, Lord, I'm going to trust you, right, no matter what happens? Like, yes, these things are making me feel good. These things are making me feel safe. But Lord, I'm going to trust you no matter what happens. And I think that's something that we can decide in our hearts even this morning. So that's the first thing, right? That Belshazzar had confidence in his walls. Second thing that Belshazzar had confidence in was his wise men. And so you see in verse 7, we'll read in verse 7 again. And the king called loudly to bring in the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers. And the king declared to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king its interpretation. Now I'm going to get to the writing itself next week, but it is interesting that it says that they couldn't even read the writing, which makes me think that maybe it was written in Hebrew, the writing on the wall. But we'll kind of get to that later. But what I want you to see here is that this is the third time in the book of Daniel, actually, that these so-called wise men have been brought in. Right, this third time in the book of Daniel, these wise men have been brought in, and every single time they proved to be completely useless. Right, time and time again, the kings of Babylon turned to sources of wisdom that are deeply respected in the world, but turn out to not provide any wisdom at all. As I think about the wise men, right, these would be the people that you would love to have some time with so they can give you some advice about your life. But because they did not acknowledge God. Right? I think the point here is because they did not acknowledge God, their wisdom would always going to be limited. In Proverbs 9:10, right, it says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is insight." Now, what does that mean? That the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. What that means is that any decision that you make, right, that doesn't acknowledge God, can't be true wisdom. Right, so if you ignore the existence of God, how can you possibly live wisely? Because to live without the reality of God at the forefront of our minds is to not live in reality at all. Right, because God is the ultimate reality. If God is the ultimate reality, then any decision that you make that does not take in consideration who God is, right, can't possibly be wisdom. Right, and this is why the Bible tells us that to ignore God is the definition of foolishness. Right, because you can try to ignore God. Right, maybe this is what Belshazzar was doing here. Right, he was trying to ignore God. He was trying to ignore what he did. But all of us eventually need to come face to face with our Creator. But I do think that Belshazzar here, in his conscience, in his heart of hearts, I think he knew that he was in the wrong. I think he knew that he was suppressing the knowledge of God. I really think that Belshazzar here, that in his heart of hearts, he knew that hosting this party was a mistake. And I think in some ways, it was maybe to escape, right? It was the hosting a party was the escape from his own conscience. He didn't want to think about the important things. He didn't want to think about the Persian army, right? He didn't want to consider whether his gods could save him. right? I think that the reason why Belshazzar had this party, I think he knew that it was not right to do so. And the reason why is because if you look at verse 4, when it says, when they drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone, and it says, immediately the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace opposite the lampstand. And then verse 6, look at Belshazzar's reaction. It says, then the king colors changed, and his thoughts alarmed him, his limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. Now, remember, Belshazzar had no idea what was written on the wall. But yet, I think he knew that he did something wrong in that moment, right? If you look at how he reacted, right, with his color changing, his thoughts alarming him, his limbs giving way, his knees knocked, I think he knew, right, that at that moment, right, that something, that he must have did something wrong. That in his heart of hearts, he knew, in his conscience, that he was wrong to do this. He knew, his conscience knew that it was wrong, but he chose to ignore it. And the thing is, I do believe that God does speak to us through our conscience. And the thing with our conscience is that it's not always perfect, right? Sometimes people say, hey, my conscience is clear. But maybe actually in those times, in some cases, maybe it shouldn't be clear, when people say that. But on the other hand, I do think that if God puts something on your conscience, right? If God puts something on your heart, that we cannot ignore it. The call to morning passage, Hebrews 3 gives us this warning, right? He says, take care, brothers, lest there be any evil, unbelieving heart leading you to fall away from the living God. But exhort one another every day, as long as it's called today, that none of you may be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. Or in other words, if God is putting something on your heart today, don't ignore it. All right, we'll see this in more detail next week, but Belshazzar couldn't have known that very night his life would be taken away from him. And so what I think this passage also teaches us is that there's urgency in getting right with God. Right? That if God is putting something on your heart today, then today is when you should respond. Right? I think sometimes we think, well, maybe when I graduate, I'll have more time to figure it out. Or when my job calms down a little bit, then I'll have time to figure it out. Or, once my crazy schedule isn't so crazy anymore, then I'll get right with God. But yet, I think the warning in this passage in Daniel 5:30 is that very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed. In other words, that there's urgency in getting right with God. And so, if God is putting something on your conscience, right? If God is putting something on your heart today, if God is putting a sin on your heart, if God is, doing something in your heart, today is the day that we should respond. I'm going to give you some time later as we come before the communion table, but the idea here is don't wait, right? I think one of the lessons in this passage is don't wait in getting right with God. Right? If God is putting something on your heart, today is the day that you should respond. And so, why did Belshazzar feel safe? Right? One, because of his walls. Second, because of his wise men. And third, and finally, because of his gods. And so if you take a look at the beginning of the chapter, there's a little detail that I skipped earlier. And so in verse 2, it says, Belshazzar, when he had tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and silver that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought, that the kings and the lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought in the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple of the house of God in Jerusalem, and its kings and its lords, his wives and his concubines, drank from them. And they drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Now, I mentioned this in a previous sermon, but when the Babylonians conquered a nation, they would take things from that nation's temple and bring it into their own temple. And basically that was a way of saying, hey, look, our gods are greater than your gods, right? Look, your gods can't even protect you, which is why we're able to pillage your temple. And they took their gods, the temple stuff in the nations that they conquered and brought it to Babylon, right? And so Belshazzar was basically saying here, right, let's remind ourselves of all the gods and all the nations that we conquered. Look, these were your religious vessels, and now we're using them to drink wine and to drink, and to have a party with. And Belshazzar was saying, hey, listen, our gods are going to protect us. Right? Look at how many nations we conquered. Our gods is not going to let us down. But once again, just like his walls, just like his wise men, right? And Daniel writes that his gods were made of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone. Right, but now he has come into contact with the living God. And it says, immediately the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall, right? And this is, of course, the hand of God, right? If you remember, this is not the first time that that God's finger wrote something, right? When Moses was handed the Ten Commandments, right? It also says that the finger of God was writing the Ten Commandments. And so, kind of in stark contrast with how Belshazzar was kind of going about this whole scenario, I want to end just by taking a look at how Daniel is being introduced. Right, we're going to get to how Daniel interacts with Belshazzar in the next week. But this is how Daniel's introduction goes, and I want to just compare that with how Belshazzar is kind of going about this situation. And so this is the queen that comes in. Now, this is probably not Belshazzar's wife, because all of his wives and his concubines were already at the party. And so this was likely, it could be Nabonidus' wife, or some have even said that maybe this is Nebuchadnezzar's wife that comes in. And so it says in verse 10, the queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banqueting hall, and the queen declared, O king, live forever. Let not your thoughts alarm you or your colors change. There's a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. In the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him the chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and astrologers, because an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret the dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. Now, for some reason, this queen remembered Daniel. And based on this description, we think she probably wasn't a believer in the one true God, right? Because she still says that this is a man who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. But based on her description, right, I think what we see here as we look at Belshazzar and Daniel are two different ways that they find hope in their life. Right, if you think about the way that Daniel is being described here, right, and how he's living his life, I think what we see here is two different ways to find hope. But if you notice, there's also a really big difference between them. Because Belshazzar had all the power, all the wealth, all the food, all the pleasures of the world. He had his palace, he had his walls, he had his wise men. He had all of that, yet his entire world was in shambles. Daniel, on the other hand, right, he was still a servant. He maybe was just completely forgotten after Nebuchadnezzar died, but still he's described as wisdom, light, and understanding. Right, and of course, am I saying that it's wrong to have all that stuff that Belshazzar had? No, that's not. The point is, where do you find your hope? Right, it's not wrong to have all that stuff Belshazzar had, but where do you find your hope? You see, 600 years after King Belshazzar would come King Jesus. Right, and while King Belshazzar lived in a palace with servants and wealth and extravagance, our king was born in a manger. Right, he came not to be served, but to serve. Right, King Belshazzar, he put his trust in his walls, his wise men, his gods, who ultimately failed him. But our king was brought to a high mountain and showed all the kingdoms of the world. Right, but he said, no, I'm going to put my trust in my Father in heaven. Right, King Belshazzar, his life was taken from him that very night. But our king willingly gave up his life for his people. You see, we can strive to have what Belshazzar had. Right, we can strive to have wealth, power, influence, thinking that it's going to bring us safety, but thinking that it's going to bring us security, or we can follow Jesus. And the really interesting thing about following Jesus is that we realize that true strength actually comes out of weakness. Right? What we realize is out of repentance and being willing to admit that you are wrong actually comes real power. Right? We realize that out of serving others actually comes real strength. We realize that out of generosity and giving your money away actually comes real wealth. Right, so let us not be confident in the things of this world, right? But as we come before the Lord's table, as we come before the communion table, let us be reminded that our greatest treasure is, in fact, that we have communion with our God. And so, as it's a communion Sunday, if you haven't already, you can pick up one of the elements. Derek is coming around with them. Derek and Ed is going to come around with them. Here at CCNC, we do believe that communion is only for baptized believers because it represents this exclusive fellowship that we have with God through Christ. But even if you're not baptized this morning, I think Jesus is inviting us to come to his table and fellowship together